Alright, guys, let's talk about the British economy today. It isn't doing very well. The country is on recession watch with big indicators starting to collapse. But instead of focusing only on their economy, it's really bizarre to see the UK giving a ton of money to Ukraine. And as we go through the numbers, you quickly realize that a British recession isn't just on the cards, it's becoming rather likely now. The first risk comes from the GDP numbers. Q3 came in at minus 0.1%, revised down from a previous estimate. So we are one quarter away from an official recession. Last October saw a fall of 0.3%, while November came in at positive 0.3. So everything is banking on December's GDP number. And as you'll see, the data isn't really good. The impact of high interest rates and the new inflation shock is threatening to push London into recession. In our lead story today, UK retail sales dropped, raising odds of recession in 2023. December's decline was the steepest since the lockdowns 3 years ago. And this is horrible news because the UK is a consumer based economy just like the US. Domestic consumption is everything. If the main driver of your economy is hurting, this will drag everything down. Retail sales might just be 5% of the overall GDP, but a collapse here will affect the wholesale industries and manufacturing as well. There's a domino effect if British consumers simply stop buying stuff. Looking at British retail sales, we can see the full magnitude of the crash. December is supposed to be the holiday season, right? People are supposed to head out, be merry, and spend money. But unlike the US, which enjoyed record sales, spending in the UK has gone negative. The amount of goods sold fell by 3.2%, making it the worst collapse since January 2021. If December was this bad, just imagine how much worse the subsequent months will be. Diving into the numbers, this crash is across the board. It's not just isolated to one particular category. Department stores are down by 7.1%, food has dropped by 3.1%, and even household goods have fallen by 3%. A big concern here is the departmental stores, the department stores. If sales continue to collapse, you'll see a nationwide closure of retailers. Rents are going up, and if revenues are falling, there's no point in burning money anymore. It's really simple logic, and that's going to affect suppliers and landlord incomes, which of course will eventually hit the employment data. But hey, the ONS is now tinkering with new experimental data. If you just tweak the survey here and there, it lowers the UK unemployment rate from 4.2% down to 3.5%. So I kind of guess everyone's wrong and the UK is in great shape. It's just how we read the data, right? But as it stands, the situation isn't looking good. It isn't looking fantastic, at least based on this set of numbers. Of all the G7 countries, the UK has one of the highest inflation and interest rates. And this makes the economy a literal oven where your buying power burns up no matter where you turn. You're getting squeezed paying the mortgage, and when you head out to the store, you're getting clobbered again. And this crisis just got worse. UK inflation rises unexpectedly, tempering talk of rate cuts. Just like in the US, inflation rebounded back up, and suddenly the idea of lowering interest rates has vanished. Annual CPI in December rose to 4% versus 3.9% last month. Economists expected inflation to drop, but it went up instead. Services has also risen with core inflation holding strong at 5.1%. So across the board, prices are heading up in the UK. So if you're living in Britain, you're gonna get squeezed yet again. In April this year, retailers are gonna face minimum wage and tax increases, which will fuel inflation even more. Higher prices always gets passed down to the consumer at the end of the day. And according to the ONS, British consumers are already getting hammered at the store. Ever since inflation took off in 2021, we can see this enormous spread between the value of retail sales and the volume of products. In other words, you're paying more money to buy fewer goods. It's like a bag of chips that shrinks in size while the price tag keeps going up. And until inflation comes down meaningfully, interest rates will be stuck where they are. The Bank of England is now in a big quandary. They can't possibly hike interest rates any further. That would collapse the economy. But neither can they cut rates. That will just reignite higher inflation. And it's not just the BOE that's confused. Bondholders are also in a state of shock. Everyone is betting on a central bank to cut interest rates, but because of the inflation rebound, that hope has gone out the window. UK inflation shock sets gilts up for the worst ever start to a year. British bonds are down by 3%. Traders are jumping ship because they kind of realize the Bank of England doesn't have room left to cut. The big drop in bond prices is a warning that inflation is still the boogeyman. We have the Red Sea crisis getting worse every day, supply chains are broken, and the UK is digging itself deeper into debt. And all this puts higher pressure on bond yields. And here's the big risk for the UK. If interest rates in the US fall faster than the UK, which is very likely, the British economy will suffer. Growth will flow towards the US while Britain will be stuck in economic stagnation. The employment numbers aren't showing a rosy picture either. Vacancies fell by 49,000 in Q4, showing that demand for jobs is starting to slip. Payroll numbers fell by 24,000 in Q4 as well. So more people are unemployed, and these are cracks that show higher rates are taking their toll on companies. If inflation doesn't comply, the BOE will be forced to keep rates higher, which pushes the UK closer towards a recession. So it's quite bewildering to see the UK still giving a ton of money to Ukraine. It's not millions of dollars but billions of pounds. From the FT, Sunak announces that the UK military aid to Ukraine will increase to 2.5 billion pounds. That's almost 3.2 billion US dollars worth of aid. I think this underlines the real fear Europe has about Russia. There's nothing more urgent than beating the Russians back, even at the expense of your own economy. According to Sunak, the UK would provide the support Ukraine needs if Russia attacks again. And it's all about showing the world that the UK has the resources and the stiff upper lip to weather a long war. Now, I don't think this package can turn the tide of the war. It's a delay tactic to prevent a defeat until the real money comes from the Americans. The $60 billion, that is the real deal. Now, there's also a financial reason why the UK is giving aid. I'm sure it's to fight the Russians, but it also benefits the British economy at least in the short term. I know this sounds weird, but the $2.5 billion to Ukraine helps British industries at a time when manufacturing is collapsing. Firstly, let's look at the state of British manufacturing, which accounts for 10% of total GDP output. And that is a significant chunk of the economy that we can't ignore. Since 2022, British manufacturing has been crashing. Within 24 months, it has gone from growth to a contraction. Anything below 50 is a contraction. Just like Germany, UK manufacturing is suffering. Higher energy costs and interest rates are making it harder for industries to stay competitive. The energy crisis isn't going away anytime soon, so Sunak has to find a way to sustain the industry. And if we zoom out and look at the world map, it's very clear that the Western economies are starting to deindustrialize. Germany is deep in the red, with the entire Eurozone as a whole suffering. And across the pond, North America isn't doing well either, except for Mexico, US and Canadian manufacturing are slightly contracting as well. Even though they are energy self-sufficient, high interest rates are making it hard for industries to survive, especially when global demand is dropping. But look at places with cheap and abundant energy: Russia, India, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. Their industries are growing. Energy costs, cheap oil, and gas is the big difference here for economic growth. It gets really interesting if we look at the timeline of EU manufacturing. It gives us a clearer picture of how important cheap energy is and the lag effect of higher input costs. 24 months ago, manufacturing PMI across Europe was in the green. Growth was phenomenal, even better than India or even China. But as Russian gas got taken away and energy sanctions started, things began to change. Energy prices soared and inflation went up, and interest rates started to rising as well. And that's why we can see a feel of rate across the entire Eurozone, except for Hungary. They still have access to cheap Russian gas, so their industries are more or less chugging along. And this brings us back to the UK giving Ukraine military aid. They aren't throwing a stack of notes but providing weapons. The UK will be providing long range missiles, air defense, and artillery ammunition. At least £200 million will be spent on providing drones, the largest delivery ever. And guess what? Most of them will be manufactured in the UK. So, in a twisted sense, sending aid to Ukraine does benefit British industries, at least those working in the war machine. Remember what Blinken said back in December? He has confirmed that war spending for Ukraine does help manufacturing. And interestingly enough, this was a statement made during David Cameron's visit to Washington. 90% of the security assistance we've provided has been spent here in the United States with our manufacturers, with our production. And that has produced more American jobs, more growth in our economy. It's not just Russia that has shifted towards a war economy. The West also realizes that funding Ukraine does help domestic manufacturing. Now, whether you agree with this or not is the reality on the ground. Now, I'd rather spend this money on healthcare and increasing oil and food production, but it's going to the military instead. And if we do a tally of the funding, the UK has now provided almost £12 billion in support to Ukraine. This, of course, includes the famous Storm Shadow missiles to a squadron of Challenger tanks. And with Sunak's latest promise, more money will continue flowing to Ukraine. Now, many of you might be asking a very good question, right? Why doesn't the UK help manufacturing directly? Why don't they give every pensioner a Bentley, an Aston Martin, or a Mini Cooper, stuff that's made in the UK? And that would surely improve the manufacturing PMI, won't it? Now, the big problem here, once again, is inflation. That is the equivalent of stimulus checks, and that's what the US Treasury did back in 2020, which laid the ground for the inflation crisis we have today. Paradoxically, sending money to Ukraine prevents an inflation problem. People back home don't get a sudden windfall of cash. At the same time, manufacturing and services benefit, and this helps to bolster GDP up. The money for Ukraine is either coming from the reserves or raising more debt. The impact will be on the balance sheet but not on the immediate inflation problem. So you can kind of see the weird state of affairs that we are in. Funding Ukraine isn't just about repelling the Russians, that's the primary objective, I'm sure, but there's a weird benefit for the domestic economy as well. The UK has a big vested interest in seeing Ukraine win. Just the financial aspect alone shows how deep the stakes are. Now, back in June last year, the UK did something rather shocking. They guaranteed $3 billion of World Bank loans to Ukraine for their recovery. That means if Ukraine can't pay back the money, the British government is on the hook. They will have to repay the World Bank. And if we look through this lens, it's becoming really understandable why Britain is doubling down. They have a lot to lose financially, so they have to keep rolling the dice. In the US, there's another wild card that's freaking Europe out. That's the return of Donald Trump. Because of his historic win in the Iowa caucus, it's increasingly likely that the Donald will be back for round two. And his win is unprecedented. Trump literally mopped the floor with the most votes, more than DeSantis, Nikki Haley, and Vivek combined. That's how insane the winning margin was. It's as if the other three didn't even exist. And if it comes down to Biden versus Trump, it's probably over, right? And that is freaking Europe out. Now, back in 2020, Trump told the Eurozone something unthinkable. According to a senior EU official, Trump told von der Leyen that the US would never help Europe under attack. So you can sense the level of panic the EU and the UK has. There's a chance of America simply walking away, right? There's already a funding deadlock in Congress, and if Trump gets in, it might be game over. So expect Europe to keep funding Ukraine until the bitter end. We are only in season 2 of this economic war. And as always, let me know what you think, guys. Will the UK fall into recession? And if Trump gets in, will the US really pull away support for Europe? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe. Be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.